As it happened, on the morning of the 24th of February, exactly a year ago, at 3 in the morning, a very dear friend from Odessa rang me up and he said, it has started. He and I had talked about the possibility of something escalating, of an escalation, after Putin had announced the recognition of the so-called Donetsk and so-called Luhansk People's Republics. So we were expecting something. He called and he said, bombs are falling. From that moment onwards, instantly, I was involved in helping people to evacuate. Many of these people had no money to travel. So within about 24 hours, I had no money left in my account. So I realized that what people really need is cash, fast cash, to do whatever it is that they needed to do, whether it was to catch a taxi, whether it was to get food, whether it was to get warm clothes to travel. And I spontaneously, I am not a person who is very attracted to large institutional operations and joining organizations in general. This was a spontaneous decision. I simply needed to collect funds to help people directly. And I had the means to do that because, having lived in Ukraine, I had a bank account and I could transfer funds instantly through international transfer services and within the Ukrainian banking system, which thankfully remained operational. We were worried that that would collapse. So I founded what I call Direct Aid. A couple of computer-savvy friends put together a very, very simple page, and I collected about $1 million through that and distributed it to internally displaced families. Some went, depending on what people wanted to dedicate the funding to, some of it went to the territorial defense units to buy night vision equipment, bulletproof vests, helmets, and so on. Mm-hmm. I simply started by sending emails out to people I knew and to organizations I knew. So to my university, King's College London, to my alma mater, Oxford, to my alma mater, Boston University. Boston University ran a special for their alumni. A lot of money came through that. And simply academics, friends and colleagues who sent the email further and further out. And I simply explained what I was doing. And what I was doing had no overheads because I was lucky enough to have been granted leave, but I was still receiving a salary, so I could continue working with, voluntarily. That meant that I could give families money. So the way that it worked is I used my Facebook page for the first time actively. I've never used Facebook before, really. And I sent out a call and said to people that if you're a family in need, you can write to me and I will try to provide you with money. So very quickly, my private messenger in Facebook filled up with requests. And what I did with them is I made video calls to all the people who were asking for money. And say there was a mother who was saying, I have 11 children and we are in real trouble. And I thought, well, really? And then I would call and there they were, all the 11 children jumping up and down. And you could see that the sandbags were blocking the windows and that, air raid sirens were on. And so I had a system of distributing, say, about $100 to a family of up to 5, $150 to a family of up to 8, and so on. So I had a sort of rough estimate of what people needed. And the reason that I decided that money was most important to give rather than food or humanitarian aid is that people had absolutely different needs. Somebody needed nappies and baby food, somebody needed crutches, somebody needed a sack of potatoes, somebody needed a pile of wood if they were in a village to burn. And I just, also the urgency of it was what was really crucial because it took international agencies months to get themselves together. I know that there are regulations. So in a sense, I was working in a way that isn't regulated, and probably I wouldn't be allowed to establish a foundation or charitable trust or to work in a legal manner, because just cash passing hands is a very tricky legal matter, but that's exactly what people needed. I know that organizations like UNICEF, they would gather food boxes, and food boxes imagine how many resources, how much time it's required to get just cardboard boxes together and then fill them with stuff that won't perish and then deliver them and then find the right families. Where here I had this absolutely direct method that was facilitated by Facebook, by social media, and simply the fact that there was a very well-functioning electronic banking system, both, you know, the transfer services in the UK and then in Ukraine. I am not sure of the number. I'm still, I have notebooks. I was writing all of that down. And I also had about a team of 6 friends who joined in to help to distribute the funding, because the funding was coming in much more rapidly than I was able to distribute it myself. For the first month and a half, I think I called about 40 to 50 families a day. So we probably helped about 2,000 families. Most of them were from the Donbass. Yeah, some were from Mariupol. You know, when it was the first three weeks, I think. The first week I probably cried after every call. And then I cried after every other call. And then I said, okay, Anastasia, you've got to sort of keep the crying for the evenings and keep going. And then you have a good cry in the evening. And now that, you know, I haven't actually cried until now that I'm coming back to that time, you know, in about half a year. But money is trickling in, and as and when it trickles in, I pass it on to families. Or, for instance, we had an initiative where I gathered a woman in Cambridge, sold all her jewelry, collected £2,000 2 months ago, and we bought camping kettles for the trenches for soldiers in Bakhmut. There are these handy things that can be lit with a small candle and produce hot water in about 2 minutes. And they have been responsible in part for there being very little frostbite in the Odessa brigade to which we sent it, which is now in Bakhmut. Well, so depending on the kinds of things that we bring in, if it's military equipment, we have to get special permission and deliver it and have it signed by the particular army units, because it's all very, very closely monitored. Even goggles, even, you know, night vision equipment, everything has to be traceable. So actually it's extremely transparent, and we have worked throughout when we were delivering things like night vision equipment with authorities and with the army units. And I had a lawyer friend who was volunteering to organize all that paperwork throughout. Now with the kettles, that's not strategically significant stuff, so we just bring it in. And there's a volunteer organization that I have worked with based in Odessa that has distributed. Before the war, they worked to provide food to disabled and elderly. So they had a fantastic network of delivery and organization, and they're the ones who went to Romania just across the border to pick up the kettles and bring 48 kettles that they brought directly to Bakhmut. In fact, a lot of supplies are freely available, including food, including a lot of things that people need are there. And that was part of the virtue of this direct aid approach, is that apart from giving people the resources for what they needed, it also kept the local economy going. They could buy the medicines locally, and they could buy food locally in most cases. When, you know, like these kettles, they're produced in Ireland, and I had a deal with the man in Ireland had already provided at no cost early on in the war some of these kettles, and he'd given them to me at a discounted cost and so on. But some things, of course, needed to be delivered from abroad, but a lot of things are available in Ukraine, and that is a very good thing to keep, you know, people working, businesses going. What attracted me to social anthropology in the first instance was precisely that it gave you a different way of looking at the world. It made the world more absurd. It made you realize that it was very strange how people organize their lives, but it gave you a special perspective. So I always look at the world as a social anthropologist, and This lens has, and the fact of my research lately being focused on language has given me a focus and a view of what's going on inside Ukraine that, yes, I guess that helps me to think about some of the tensions inside the country that revolve around language as social process. So the striking thing is I started learning more about Ukraine's, independent Ukraine's political history, because of course I'm not a specialist on Ukraine, I'm a specialist on India. The striking thing that I realized is that Ukrainians have been extraordinarily resistant to culture wars. And culture wars in every country have their own flavor. They have their own flavor in the United States. In Ukraine, the flavor is language, because that really is the only way in which the population at all can be divided. The country is mostly Orthodox Christian. The country is racially, not very mixed. And how do you tell a Russian and a Ukrainian apart? The fact that they're ethnic Russians, the fact that they're ethnic Ukrainians, is rather a myth. What do Ukrainians eat more borscht, really? So language is a real difference that can be weaponized, that can be politicized. But the history and the culture, the linguistic culture in Ukraine has been such that has made people resistant to this polarization through language, because everybody in Ukraine knows both Ukrainian and Russian. In some places people speak more Russian, in some places people speak more Ukrainian. In most of the country, people speak one or another kind of mix known as surzik. So it's a very flexible, it's a very fluid linguistic environment. So my family, for instance, I grew up speaking Russian. My father grew up speaking Russian and Yiddish in northern Ukraine. I have family in Bucha who speak Ukrainian. I have family in central Ukraine who speak surzik. When we get together, we either code switch, or we just continue speaking the language that is most comfortable for us, our home language, while understanding the other very easily. So this kind of culture and the history of Ukraine as it finds itself after 91 is such that it's difficult to rock it. It's difficult to polarize it. But very concerted attempts have been made to do that since 2010 with language policy, which restricts the use of Russian, has restricted the use of Russian, especially after 2015. And that starts to really upset people, and that is creating tensions that are on the rise. It's a harrowing time, but it is the kind of opportunity that Ukraine would have never gotten if something as horrible as this wouldn't have happened. The fact that Ukraine is now celebrated around the world, the fact that it transformed, not overnight, but over the course of this year, from some sort of post-Soviet state, that has got Chernobyl and babushkas and corruption, into a place of extraordinary heroism where people genuinely are preferring to die for a free political future. They're preferring a political life of the kind that they have fought for since 2004, at least, and earlier. They're preferring that to physical existence. And this is fact, and that is extraordinary. And it has united Europe, it has united the West. The idea of the West that seemed to be dying is back, isn't it? And I think that kind of history will have all kinds of consequences, certainly in the long term, but even in the short term, in terms of investment, in terms of Ukraine becoming a major hub of economic, of political, of cultural activity. And my experience, the reason that I have semi-returned to it in 2020 is that after 2014, I got back there and I felt that this was a very new and different place, full of bustling aspiration, full of hope, full of excitement. People really felt that they have done a lot to change, to turn their future. And now this has come to a head. The fact that people didn't raise a white flag, but they rose a Ukrainian flag and they're fighting for it, that's not an invention. This is reality. And it's a place that is between, I think it's a place of special cultural opportunity, because it's a place between the tyrannical Russian world, and it's also not quite Europe, with its own culture wars and its own trouble and its own problems of, you know, racism and gender, and things are different in Ukraine. It's an alternative, and it's a very exciting opportunity.